The history of comics in North America is usually framed as the history of superheroes, but there's an important, overlooked side story that happened at the same time. It's one that would have a noticeable impact on the future of comics themselves. Without it, comics might not have hit the prominence and acceptance they achieved in the 1980s. There were a lot of pioneers and pioneering titles that go unrecognized. For some, their contribution may be small, but the cumulative effect is what's important. What they succeeded in proving was there was a healthy demand for comic book material produced for a more mature audience. Additionally, there was a venue for creators or companies that produced material that was an alternative to mainstream outlets. Without these works and their influence, the future of the medium might have looked entirely different. There are three very important elements: the creators and publishers who worked outside the restraints of the censorship board, the Comics Code Authority, and published work adhering to their own standard. This will be the main focus. The other two factors are interrelated. That would be the opening of comic book specialty stores and the creation of a distribution system to these stores. This is commonly known as the direct market. All three make up the alternate history of comics, and they all play an important role. Remove one element, and the other two would likely not survive. Without all three working in tandem, the history of comic books themselves might have taken a different path. Alright, let's dive into this. The alternate timeline begins with the anti-comics crusade of the 1950s. This movement, spearheaded by Frederick Wortham and other politically motivated individuals, ended with the creation of the Comics Code Authority in 1954. The mandate of that censorship board was to ensure that comic books didn't contribute to juvenile delinquency. That perceived issue, along with the paranoia concerning the influence of communism, were the social concerns of that era. Strict guidelines for comic books were enforced. Those that didn't adhere to these rules would not get their material distributed to outlets such as newsstands and convenience stores. Genres such as horror and crime were banned outright, as was any material that questioned authority. The medium was sanitized and codified as material strictly intended for children. The Comics Code created a void in the medium for many years. This void is where the Undergrounds, Overgrounds, and the alternative titles would thrive. God Knows, published in 1964 by Jack Jackson, is often recognized as the first underground comic. However, Gilbert Shelton, who would later create the fabulous furry Freak Brothers, was also doing the bizarre superhero Wonder Warthog in a variety of publications. Most of the underground comic book material before 1967 was published in counterculture magazines, such as the LA Free Press, the East Village Other, and in Canada, the Georgia Straight. For the most part, the circulation of these magazines were regional, so they had an influence overall, but they were disjointed pieces that had yet to coalesce into a proper movement. The publication of Zap Comics No. 1 in 1967 by Robert Crumb is a touchstone moment for this alternate history of comics. Following the publication of the first issue, Crumb solicited work from other underground artists. Zap then became a collective of like-minded individuals who inspired one another. The core group, who contributed to every issue thereafter, was Crumb, Rick Griffin, S. Clay Wilson, Spain, Gilbert Shelton, Victor Moscoso, and Robert Williams. Within a short amount of time, other homegrown publishing companies emerged. Apex Novelties, the publishing company literally created to print Zap Comics No. 1, would be joined by Ripoff Press, Print Mint, and Last Gasp, all of whom worked out of the San Francisco area. These underground comics were an actual artistic movement within the medium. Like most worthwhile movements, it was rooted in rebellion. On the surface, they appeared to revel in sex and drugs, but they were also about being anti-authoritarian and anti-establishment. They were undeniably inspired by the counterculture movement of the era, but equally, the Undergrounds were a response to the repressive nature of comic books in general. The movement demanded and epitomized total creative freedom for the talent involved. In order to distribute these comics, the publishers used the system already in place to send merchandise to what was commonly known as head shops. Head shops had a very specialized clientele. They stocked items that were usually focused on or related to the devil's lettuce. So as a system for comic book distribution, it was not ideal, but it worked. The Undergrounds weren't the only notable development in the 1960s. The writer and artist, Wally Wood, would develop two projects to produce more creatively interesting material. The first was Thunder Agents in 1965, a superhero team that was worked on by a number of writers and artists. This was a mainstream title that had a few spin-offs, and it ended in 1969 when the publisher went out of business. In 1966, Wood put together Wit's End, a title that appears to be the first overground comic. Let me explain that term. Overground or ground-level comics, both terms are essentially interchangeable, were comics that were mature but weren't as hardcore and explicit as the Undergrounds. So Overgrounds were mainstream comics for an adult audience, but they weren't rooted in counterculture like the Undergrounds. There was some nudity, language was a bit looser, and the stories reflected a creator's interests. There was no editorial restrictions, other than Wally Wood's own taste and what he thought should be published. As well as Wood's own stories, Wit's End would publish a number of well-known creators, such as Al Williamson, Gray Morrow, Harvey Kurtzman, Vaughn Bode, Bernie Wrightson, and Steve Ditko. These were all mainstream creators who were given freedom of expression and the rights to their own material. This was an ethic the Undergrounds had established, and it was something not offered by traditional publishers. Unfortunately, Wit's End was a comic that was slightly ahead of its time. It was a great avenue of expression for the creators, but there simply wasn't a dedicated market for this comic. It was too mature for mainstream distribution, and a bit tame for the underground channels. It highlighted the void in the medium where quality material for adults couldn't find its audience. Both of these efforts by Wood were a creator looking for a venue that didn't exist. So, he tried to create one with brute force. Unfortunately, it would be a few years before there was both a method and a place for material of this nature. That method was a new distribution channel, and the place was the emergence of comic book specialty stores. By 1974, there were, roughly, 200 or 300 comic book stores. The exact number is unknown, but the presence indicated there was an emerging culture around collecting comic books. Generally speaking, they were focused on back-issue sales. The annual publication of the Overstreet Comic Book Price Guide, which began in 1970, was based on a compilation of these comic store sales. In 1972, Phil Sealing, who owned one of these specialty stores, approached publishers with the idea of creating a distribution company that sent new issues to these stores. He made a very unique proposition. In exchange for a healthy discount on the cover price, comic book stores would keep whatever they ordered. There would be no returns of unsold material. This was different from traditional distribution, where comics were sent to outlets, set on the shelves for 3 months, and whatever wasn't sold was then returned to the publisher. These comics were usually destroyed, and they became a loss for the publisher. At least, that's how the system worked in principle. Allegedly, there was a fair amount of corruption and some, let's say, creative accounting. With the system Sealing proposed, all sales to comic book stores were final sales for the publishing companies. It was a very simple system where the comic book stores took the risk, but it was minimized by the discount they received from publishers. Another bonus for both publishers and stores was this direct system put new material on display within a few days of it being printed. With traditional distribution, new material took weeks and weeks to get to an outlet and then displayed. To Sealing's credit, he managed to get the publishers to see the positives of this system and get them to sign an agreement. This was the beginning of the direct market. That one idea and the creation of Seagate Distributors was an important development in the future of comic books. Other distributors would arise over the next decade, and eventually, some censorship guidelines were enforced. However, it was a method not beholden to the comics code, and it allowed new publishers an avenue to put their comics in front of an audience. It was the market Wally Wood tried to find in the late 1960s, and now it existed. 1974 was another touchstone year, and it proved the potential of this new distribution model for small press, independent titles. This is epitomized by 3 titles: Starreach, Hot Stuff, and The First Kingdom, all of which began this year. Of the 3, Starreach was definitely the most influential. It was edited and published by Mike Friedrich, a former writer for both Marvel and DC. In the first issue, he included the work of Jim Starlin, Walt Simonson, and Howard Chaykin. Future issues would include the work of Len Wein, John Workman, Frank Bruner, P. Craig Russell, and Ken Stacy, to name just a few. While it had a rocky start, there was a year gap between the first and second issue. Star Reach settled into place early on, and new issues arrived roughly every 3 months afterwards. Like Wits End before it, all the creators retained their rights and enjoyed a level of freedom they weren't allowed working for Marvel or DC. Star Reach proudly wore the title of a ground-level comic. It was almost entirely science fiction themed, with a few graphic scenes, some nudity, and relaxed restrictions on language. It was, most certainly, for an adult audience. Unlike the Undergrounds, it contained straightforward stories where mature situations occurred organically. That is, if there was some sexual content, it was part of the story, rather than being the point of the story. This is what distinguished Star Reach and other overground or ground-level comics from the underground scene. Hot Stuff is likely a title many have never heard about. It was similar to Star Reach and contained an equal amount of talent, although its standout contributor was Richard Corbin, whose work appeared in almost every issue. Possibly the reason Hot Stuff isn't well remembered is because it was rather infrequent, only publishing an issue every year. Otherwise, the quality is similar, and an important example of the emerging overground scene. The final notable title this year was The First Kingdom by Jack Katz. The best way to describe the comic is to quote Katz from the introduction to the first issue. Quote, "This is a novel in which the characters live in front of you, like a silent motion picture. The freedom of the alternative press has given me this unusual opportunity to realize the potential I feel this art form is capable of expressing." Unquote. Katz may not be well known, but he had been in the industry for decades before The First Kingdom saw print. His career started around 1944, and he worked on numerous titles for numerous companies over the next 30 years. When he was exposed to underground comics, he saw the possibility of the medium to be more than juvenile adventures about rigidly heroic figures, because until that point, that's all he had been allowed to produce. Katz was greatly influenced by the work of Hal Foster, the artist most remembered for the long-running Prince Valiant comic strip. Katz applied the same artistic standard established by Foster, and he created an epic story that is somewhat difficult to summarize. It's a story told over generations, with meddling gods, primitive humans, and somehow it transforms into a science fiction space opera. To say it was ambitious might be an understatement. The actual success of these titles is hard to determine, other than to point out their longevity. Star Reach ran for 18 issues and ended in 1979. Hot Stuff had a shorter run, going for 8 issues and ending in 1978. The First Kingdom would be published in 24 issues before reaching its planned conclusion in 1986. While Star Reach is usually mentioned as an influential title, the other two certainly contributed to this developing method of publishing. Hot Stuff because of its similar quality, and The First Kingdom because of its scope and its approach to comics as a medium of expression. During this time, there were a few other notable developments. In 1975, Robert Crumb started Arcade, the Comics Review. This project brought together artists to produce mature, independent work. It included Zippy the Pinhead, Nart and Pat, and the work of Kim Deitch and Art Spiegelman. Crumb himself produced less explicit work that was not overly satirical and rooted in counterculture. It was the closest he would come to doing actual, mainstream work. In the following year, 1976, American Splendor would begin. This title, by Harvey Pekar and a variety of artists, was one of the first ongoing autobiographical series. It was almost entirely about Pekar's life and experiences. It came out periodically and built a dedicated cult following. Star Reach expanded its lineup with Quack in 1976. This was a funny animal title created to publish a rejected story idea the artist, Frank Bruner, had for Howard the Duck. Although short-lived, it contained the early work of Dave Sim. In fact, Sim would propose a new series, Cerebus, and submit it to the publisher, Mike Friedrich. Friedrich passed. Sim and his partner, Denny Lubert, then self-published this title, and over the next few years, Cerebus became an independent darling. Coincidentally, at the same time, Friedrich passed on another title, ElfQuest. This series, by Wendy and Richard Pini, would be self-published in 1978. This ongoing fantasy series would continue on for many years, slowly expanding its mythos and history, becoming an epic on the scale of Lord of the Rings. It was notable for its sexual fluidity and polyamory at a time when that was very taboo. Its overall influence on genre fiction cannot be overstated. 1977 saw another development that likely had a huge effect on the medium. That would be the beginning of heavy metal, which brought European-style comics to North America. While it did include such artists as Moebius and Bilal, heavy metal also published the work of North American underground artists, such as Richard Corbin and Charles Burns. That same year, an equally important title began, 2000 AD. That weekly British title would premiere with a character that has achieved legendary status, Judge Dredd. Many other series, such as Rogue Trooper, Nemesis the Warlock, Zenith, Strontium Dog, and DR and Quinch, would be published in 2000 AD, making it a premier title of British talent, many of whom would find success in North America in the coming decades. Finally, in 1978, Eclipse published Saber by Don McGregor and Paul Gulacy. This is often mentioned as the first graphic novel produced for the direct market. By the end of the decade, this era of overground comics was coming to an end. Or more accurately, it was evolving past its underground, do-it-yourself roots. As more comic book stores emerged, the audience for independent comics also expanded. While the two mainstream publishers were floundering, with DC canceling the majority of its titles in 1978 and Marvel seeing decreased sales across its entire line, the direct market was doing well for smaller, dedicated publishers. It was a viable method for anyone working outside the mainstream model. However, everything was about to change. The term alternative comic needs a little definition. The alternatives, unlike the overgrounds, were even more mainstream. Alternative publishers, such as First, Pacific, and Comico, all of whom began in the early 80s, offered content that was similar but different from what was being published by Marvel and DC. They were, literally, the alternative to the mainstream. To put it another way, the alternatives were, generally speaking, superhero concepts with a slight, more mature twist. Nexus, Badger, Starslayer, and Grimjack, all from First Comics, being prime examples of this difference in approach. The most important title that sat in the gap between the Overgrounds and the alternatives was Love and Rockets. This title, which began in 1981 by the brothers Hernandez, was a sleeper hit that combined very mature themes, experimental artwork, and elements from practically every genre of the medium. There was romance, science fiction, comedy, fantasy, superheroes via wrestling superstars, and deep, slowly evolving tales about the characters Maggie, Hopi, and the people of Palomar. It was a comic rooted in Latino culture, but its appeal was for anyone who liked the medium and enjoyed great characters within great stories that could go just about anywhere. Its influence is all over the medium. The early to mid-80s saw an explosion of alternative publishers and titles. It was quite possibly the most active period for the medium since 1954. One series stood out among all others, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This was a breakout, direct market hit. Its success started a small bubble of speculation in the mid-1980s. This bubble was known as the black and white boom. Countless animal titles were published, and comic book stores ordered them in bulk, anticipating another Turtles hit. Although, another hit on the level of the Turtles was never found. It was a very brief trend. It lasted, at best, for an entire year, before these titles died off, and black and white titles in general saw a huge slump in sales. However, this black and white boom was a precursor to the speculator frenzy that would occur in the early 90s. Since 1974, Marvel and DC were shipping comics to the direct market, but neither paid much attention to the potential it offered. This slowly changed in 1980. This was due, in part, to Mike Friedrich. When he discontinued Starreach, Friedrich began working at Marvel as their specialty sales manager, a position he would leave in 1982. During this time, he advocated for Marvel to produce comics exclusively for the direct market. This led to Dazzler No. 1 being published at the end of 1980 and sold only to comic book stores. This one-shot sold over 400,000 copies, which was amazing for a comic about a superhero who generated a disco light show. From there, Marvel committed other titles such as Micronauts, Khazar, and Moon Knight to this market. DC tested the direct market with Madame Xanadu. Its sales were 1/4 of Dazzler's sales, but those were healthy numbers for DC. And again, it proved the untapped potential of selling directly to comic book stores. By the mid-80s, both mainstream publishers were doing their best to exploit the market they had ignored for years. And it's here the alternate history of comics and the more popular history of superheroes begin to overlap and merge. By the end of the decade, Marvel and DC were seeing their sales skyrocket, while the alternatives were seeing the opposite. Many pivotal, pioneering alternative publishers, such as First and Comico, slowly faded out of existence. This wasn't entirely due to the pressure exerted by the mainstream, but it certainly contributed a great deal. There's one final key moment in this piece of history. That would be the formation of Image Comics. As is well known, 7 popular creators split from Marvel and DC to form their own publishing company in 1993. Their undeniable, massive success was a matter of timing and opportunity, along with some good choices, and a desire to gain the credit and profit they deserved from their efforts. At this point, the direct market was the best avenue for comic book sales. Unfortunately, it was flooded with mainstream material, and that drowned out a lot of independent voices. The crash of the market circa 1994 made it even harder for an independent title to gain any traction. The market that had come into existence and allowed independent titles to thrive was now almost entirely unsupportive of their presence. In my opinion, this alternate history of comics does end with Image. In many ways, Image benefited from the pioneering efforts of those that preceded them. And most importantly, they are the apex of those pioneering efforts. They are the best result possible for a group of disillusioned artists who were tired of the mainstream and decided to go their own way. They weren't pioneers or revolutionaries, as the legend likes to suggest. Hell, they were barely rebels. But they didn't have to be any of those things, because all the foundational work had already been done before they became a collective. All they had to do was sit down and do the hard work of creating. And to their credit, they did. Eventually, Image would transform into something resembling a safe haven for other independent creators. Hopefully, that becomes the legacy of the Image Collective, which, for those that follow in the decades to come, is an area of future history to explore. For me, my work here is done. Almost. There are a number of footnotes to this video, all of which are in the description below. There are a few I should mention right here. Some might disagree with the terminology and their definitions. That's fair. I went with the common usage from my experience. Certainly, there will be differences of opinion, which brings me to the most important footnote. I don't consider this to be the final word on this portion of history. This is a first draft for others to build on and add to. Which doesn't mean you should steal this video and rewrite it. That's not research, that's plagiarism. No, I mean expand on the areas where this is lacking and add to the history. Or for that matter, correct it. The idea there's an area of comic book history, one that doesn't focus on superheroes, is the freeware portion of this video, not the actual video itself. In fact, that's my challenge to you, the viewer, and for others in the ComicsTube space. What's missing? What needs further examination? Why do fools fall in love? Cut to the credits, please, editor version of myself. I'm done talking. Thank you for watching. If you haven't already, give this video a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Once again, this channel continues to go through a period where the algorithm just ignores these videos. So that's not great, and it needs to change. If you can support the channel, please do. I cannot emphasize that enough. With that said, thanks to all my fine supporters on YouTube and Patreon. Your contributions are very appreciated. Thank you so very, very much. You make it possible for this channel to limp along in its current state. Extra special thanks to Constant Disappointment Records, Jeff Nicholson, Sicken, Francis De La Cruz, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, L.S. Gregor, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. Until next time.